Just curious, what device are you watching on? Phone, TV, laptop? Comment below.
It's strange, isn't it? How sometimes the deepest betrayals don't come from enemies or strangers, but from the people who should have known you best. And not because they hated you or meant you harm, but because they never bothered to look at you in the first place. I can still see that living room, my mom's polished oak coffee table stacked with real simple magazines, my dad in his usual chair with his phone in hand, and my sister Lindsay perched on the arm of the couch like she owned the damn house, which, well, eventually, she kind of did. That was the evening I realized it wasn't just favoritism or old habits, or that maybe I was imagining it all. No, that was the night I saw it for what it really was. A lifelong pattern of quiet neglect disguised as parenting. And I just sat there, 39 years old, third promotion in 5 years, top of my game at a major tech firm, and not a single soul in that room even asked me how work was going. They never celebrated any of it. Not the time I bought my first condo entirely on my own. No cosigner, no help. Not the time I flew them to New York to see me speak at a conference. And they canceled last minute because Lindsay's cat was sick. Not even when I landed a national contract that brought millions into the company and a sizable bonus into my pocket. I remember calling my mom after I signed that deal, just hoping that maybe this time she'd say something other than, "That's nice, sweetheart." But she barely heard me because Lindsay was crying over a breakup with some yoga instructor she'd dated for 3 weeks. And Mom said, "Can I call you back?" And never did. At some point, I started asking myself, what was wrong with me? Was I too quiet? Too self-sufficient? Did I make it too easy to be forgotten? Because Lindsay, God love her, she made noise. She needed things. She cried and laughed loudly and always had some minor crisis to drag the whole house into. She once got grounded in high school for sneaking out, and my parents felt so bad about it they took her shopping the next day to cheer her up. Me? I once sprained my ankle during track practice and limped home alone because nobody had shown up to pick me up. I iced it myself and made dinner for the family that night. My dad told me I was tough as nails. At the time, I thought it was a compliment. Now I know it was a convenient excuse to never worry about me. And then came the beach house. That's when all the excuses stopped. That's when I stopped pretending this was just some accidental imbalance. We were all sitting together for dinner, a rare thing these days, but I'd flown in from Seattle because Mom insisted on a family night. I even moved meetings around for it. I showed up with a bottle of nice wine and a box of pastries from a bakery they used to love when I was a kid. I wore my best blazer, the one that made me feel like I had my life together, even though I was already unraveling on the inside. And Lindsay, of course, showed up in yoga pants and a messy bun, late as usual, laughing into her phone. The conversation was typical. Dad talking about the neighbor's lawn, Mom worried about the squirrels getting into her bird feeder, and Lindsay going on about some Instagram collab she might be doing with a local hotel. Then, somewhere between the salad and the main course, my mom clapped her hands together like a giddy schoolgirl and said, "Oh, we forgot to tell you. Your father and I bought Lindsay a beach house." I thought I misheard. I really did. I blinked and looked at my dad, who just nodded and kept eating like this was the most casual update in the world. A beach house. A full ocean-facing property in Seaside. Bought with cash, a little gift after all the hard work she's been putting in, my mom added. As if running wine tastings at a boutique vineyard twice a week was some Herculean feat. I sat there, my fork frozen midair, while Lindsay gave a little squeal and said, "I'm gonna make it so cute, maybe even Airbnb it part-time. Get a little passive income, you know?" My mom beamed like her daughter had just solved climate change. My dad said, "Smart girl." And nobody looked at me. Not once. Not one word about my promotion last quarter. Not a "how's Seattle treating you?" Not a "congrats on that Forbes article we saw online." I realized in that moment they hadn't even read it. They didn't know because they never asked. And here's the kicker. I wasn't even angry at first. Just numb. You know that kind of numb that creeps into your chest and makes your hands feel like they belong to someone else? That's what I felt. It was like I finally understood that this wasn't about me not trying hard enough. This wasn't something I could fix with another accolade or a bigger paycheck or a more expensive birthday present for mom. This wasn't about effort at all. It was about priority, and I was never one. Tell me something. Have you ever been in a room full of people who are supposed to love you and felt like the most invisible person in the world? Because if you have, you know exactly what I felt that night. I left early, claiming I had a flight to catch, even though it wasn't until the next morning. As I walked out, I heard Lindsay say, "Well, she's always so busy, isn't she?" And my mother, who gave me life, said, "That's Rachel, always running." And I realized they never wondered why I was always running, or where I was running from. But I knew it was the beginning of the end. That was the night I stopped trying to be their daughter and started becoming a stranger. There's a silence that settles into your bones when you realize that you could scream in a room full of your own blood, and no one would look up, not because they hate you, but because they've never really tuned into the sound of your voice in the first place. That silence followed me the night of what would become the last family dinner I ever attended. And it didn't feel dramatic at the time, or final, or even like a stand. It just felt like a slow suffocation, like trying to breathe underwater while everyone around you is comfortably floating on the surface. And the worst part wasn't even the indifference. It was the ease with which they all carried on, like I was an extra in a scene that had already been written without me in mind, like my presence was incidental, not required, not even noticed unless I said something out of line or too serious. I remember that night in sharp, unforgiving detail. The way the wine tasted flat no matter how expensive it was. The way my mother kept adjusting the throw pillows on the couch like she was performing for a Better Homes and Gardens photo shoot. And the way Lindsay's laughter dominated every corner of the room. That loud, theatrical cackle she used like currency to buy attention, approval, love. They gave her all of it, freely, like it was endless. And me? I sat there with my back straight and my hands folded too politely on my lap, smiling at all the right moments, nodding like a well-trained diplomat, trying, always trying, not to seem bitter or dramatic or too intense, because if I was anything other than pleasant, they would tell me I was ruining the night. Dinner was roast chicken, dry as paper, overcooked carrots, and that stale store-bought pie my mother insisted was from a charming little bakery near the park she'd never actually visited. Lindsay walked in almost an hour late, still in leggings and a sweatshirt with someone else's name on it, probably her ex, the yoga guy she said cheated but still texted every other weekend. She didn't apologize for being late. She walked in talking, already in the middle of a story no one had asked for, flopped onto the couch like it was her throne, and 5 minutes later my dad was handing her the remote and asking what she wanted to watch after dinner. I didn't say much. I'd learned by then that nothing I said would stick. I could have announced that I was buying a house in Spain, that I was writing a book, that I was adopting twins from Ghana, and they'd probably blink once, nod, and go back to asking Lindsay about her kombucha hobby, or whatever cleanse she was pretending to do that month. The worst part? I used to think that if I just found the right moment, if I timed it perfectly and said the right words, they'd finally see me, finally realize all the things I'd quietly carried. All the ways I'd built my life alone, brick by brutal brick. But that night, I realized that the moment had passed. If it had ever existed at all. Somewhere between the dry chicken and the barely warm pie, Lindsay leaned over and told us she was thinking of making the beach house her passive income project. She said it like she'd discovered real estate investing all by herself, like the house hadn't been handed to her like a prize for breathing. She said she'd probably do a light remodel, throw in some boho furniture, maybe work with a local influencer to stage it, make it Instagrammable. And when she said it, my mother nodded like Lindsay had just solved a major housing crisis, said, "Oh, you're so clever, sweetheart." And my father added, "That's the kind of initiative we love to see." I almost laughed. I truly did. It bubbled up in my chest like bile, acidic and ugly, but I swallowed it because I knew, if I laughed, they'd look at me like I was crazy, and once again, I'd be the problem. I stayed until dessert, or rather, until they all started pretending that cardboard pie tasted just like Grandma used to make. even though Grandma was Italian and never baked a damn pie in her life. I pushed my plate away, said I had an early flight back to Seattle, and stood up. No one objected. No one asked why I was leaving so soon or how I was getting to the airport or if I needed anything. Lindsay made a joke about me always being on the go, and my mother said, "She's such a busy bee." Like being busy was some sort of personality flaw I'd chosen just to be difficult. On the drive back to my hotel, I kept waiting to cry, kept checking in with myself like, "Now? Are you going to break now?" But nothing came. No tears, no shouting, just a kind of weightless calm, like something that had been holding me down for decades had quietly unlatched itself. It wasn't that I didn't care anymore. It's that I finally understood there was no winning here, no perfect version of me that would make them love me more than they already loved her. No number of promotions, no raise big enough, no accolade prestigious enough to outweigh Lindsay's ability to laugh loudly and make herself the center of every room she walked into. So I didn't cry. I made a plan. The next morning, I didn't go to the airport. I called my assistant and told her to clear my calendar for the next 3 days. I didn't explain. I didn't need to. I booked another hotel, one they didn't know I'd ever stayed at before, on the opposite side of the city, and I sat down with a legal pad and wrote out what I needed to do to start detaching, not just from my parents, but from the version of myself that had spent nearly 40 years trying to be someone worth noticing. I made a list. Digital footprints to erase, people to inform, addresses to reroute, locks to change. It wasn't about revenge. It wasn't about punishment. It was about oxygen. That dinner didn't destroy me. It set me free, not because it was painful, though it was, but because it was so stunningly ordinary, so predictably heartbreaking, so familiar in its coldness that I could finally see it for what it was, my last warning. And this time, I listened. There's a kind of satisfaction that doesn't come with raised voices or smashed glass or public declarations of cutting someone off. It comes in the form of absence, in the unsettling quiet that follows when someone who's always been there, always shown up, always kept the peace, and filled in the emotional gaps, simply disappears. No fireworks, no drama, no confrontations on the porch with tears and accusations, just gone. And when it's done right, strategically, silently, with the patience of someone who's been invisible for decades, it doesn't just confuse people. It destabilizes them. Because people like my parents weren't prepared for my absence to mean something. They were only prepared for my presence to mean nothing. The day after that dinner, I initiated what I eventually started calling, in my mind, the extraction. It felt like a military operation, though no one would have known by looking at me. Just a woman in her late 40s, neatly dressed, calm voice on the phone, ordering name changes on documents, redirecting mail, canceling the family group plan on the phone bill that I had been paying for years. One by one, I began untying the knots that bound me to them. Not with malice or even grief, but with the kind of sober focus you get when you finally accept that no amount of love given guarantees love received. I deleted shared calendars, removed myself from auto-billing anything that included their addresses, and called the credit card company to end the account where I'd once added my mother as an authorized user, back when she said her purse had been stolen and never got around to replacing half her cards. I had a folder, physically and digitally, labeled Freedom Plan, and I treated it with more attention than I'd given most romantic relationships. And then I did the quietest thing of all. I disappeared from their narrative. I didn't block them. No, that would have sent a message. I let the phone ring but never answered. I left texts unread, not deleted. I let emails pile up, unanswered, unopened. Not because I couldn't bear to read them, but because I didn't care to know what excuses or passive concern they were lobbing at me now that my loyalty was no longer a guarantee. There is a specific cruelty in being ignored. Yes, but there is also a very specific kind of power in being the one who chooses to ignore, not out of vengeance, but because you've finally outgrown the need for someone's attention. At first, nothing happened. a few check-in texts from my mother that sounded like generic holiday greetings from an old colleague. Hope you're well, miss you. My father sent a forwarded article about budgeting. Ironic, since they never asked how I afforded anything in my life, nor cared. Lindsay posted a passive-aggressive Instagram story about some people thinking they're too good for family over a filtered video of her holding a mimosa near a fireplace that probably wasn't even hers. They weren't concerned yet. They were still operating under the assumption that I'd come around like I always had, that I was just having a mood or being dramatic, as they used to say when I was a teenager, and tried to express actual pain. But then a few weeks passed, then a month, and something in their tone shifted. My mother left a voicemail, not her usual chirpy tone, but a careful, almost rehearsed softness that said, "Honey, just let us know you're okay. We're getting a little worried." My father called 3 times in one day, which hadn't happened since my appendix surgery in college. Lindsay emailed me. She never emailed. Subject line, "Where the hell are you, body? You can't just ghost your whole family because of one dinner. Grow up." It had never been about one dinner, but the fact that she thought it was, that she framed my extraction as a tantrum, proved to me once again that they hadn't listened then and wouldn't start now. So I said nothing. I didn't respond. I kept going. I moved apartments, nothing extravagant, just something smaller, more intentional, with no emotional history clinging to the walls. I got a new number, changed my emergency contacts at work, told only 3 people, my closest friend, my assistant, and my therapist, what I was doing and why. And even they didn't fully understand. "You sure you don't want to write a letter or have one final conversation?" my therapist asked gently. I said no because there was no final conversation that would change the decades that came before it. No eloquent speech that would rearrange the truth they'd lived so comfortably inside. They didn't want me. They wanted access to me. And that wasn't the same thing. The thing about disappearing is that most people can't do it. Not really. They try, delete an account, go off-grid for a weekend, but they always leave breadcrumbs, little signs they hope someone will find. But I didn't want to be found. I wanted to live in the freedom that came from no longer trying to be discovered by people who never looked in the first place. I wanted peace. Not the kind you beg for, but the kind you carve out of silence. 3 months after I vanished, Lindsay posted a long, weepy video about losing family to ego, and my mother started sending birthday cards to my old address, even though they were all returned. My dad left a voicemail, drunk or pretending to be, saying, "We didn't mean to make you feel like that," without ever saying what that was. But by then I had learned something beautiful and painful and permanent. When you vanish the right way, not in a blaze of fury, but in the stillness of self-preservation, people start to realize that the person they thought would always be there might have never truly been seen. And that haunts them more than any argument ever could. They weren't looking for me because they missed me. They were looking because my absence made them uncomfortable. Because for the first time in their lives, they had to consider the possibility that maybe I'd always been the glue, and now the pieces were cracking apart without me. And the best part? I didn't need to say a word to make it happen. It had been almost a year since I disappeared. Not in the melodramatic pack-a-bag-and-flee kind of way that teenagers romanticize, but in the slow, deliberate unraveling of every thread that had tied me to them, each one snipped with care, not vengeance. I had built a new life not marked by grand change or aesthetic rebranding, but by a calm, unshakable peace that had taken me decades to realize I was allowed to claim. I didn't relocate to Bali, didn't quit my job to start painting on cliffsides. I simply existed on my own terms, free from the exhausting, suffocating pull of needing to be understood by people who had shown, in action if not in words, that they weren't interested in understanding me at all. And in that stillness, in that sacred quiet I had carved out for myself, I had found a rhythm that felt like truth. So when they came knocking, literally, not metaphorically, it didn't feel dramatic or even surprising. It felt inevitable. Because people like my parents, like Lindsay, they can ignore everything until the absence becomes too loud to dismiss. until your silence becomes a mirror they can't stand to look into, reflecting back all the moments they chose convenience over connection, control over compassion, and performance over presence. They showed up unannounced, of course. No warning, no call ahead. Just the sound of a knock I hadn't heard in years, followed by my mother's voice, half sweet, half anxious, calling my name like I was still the child hiding in her room after one of Lindsay's many staged emotional implosions. I didn't open the door right away. I stood in the hallway just out of view, letting them sit in the uncertainty they'd never had to experience before, letting them feel, if only for a minute, what it was like to want something from me and not get it. When I finally opened it, I didn't smile, didn't frown, didn't fall into their emotional tempo. I simply looked at them, two people who had raised me, housed me, fed me, and yet never once truly seen me. My mother's eyes scanned my apartment, taking inventory like she was inspecting a hotel room, while my father avoided my gaze entirely, shifting his weight from foot to foot like a teenager caught doing something stupid. And then there was Lindsay, standing just behind them, arms crossed, face unreadable, as if deciding what part she'd play today, victim, mediator, or martyr. "We just want to talk," my mother said, her voice light, rehearsed, like she'd practiced this on the drive over. "We miss you, sweetheart." I let them in, not out of warmth or weakness, but because I wanted to hear what version of the story they had come to sell. I made tea, slowly with intention, letting the silence stretch between us, letting them sit in the discomfort they were so unused to experiencing. For years, I had filled every silence with effort. Jokes, questions, compliments, updates on work they didn't care about. Not this time. My mother talked first, of course. She always did. She went on about family, about losing our way, about how things have felt off for a while now, as if this was a mutual drift and not the result of decades of directional neglect. My father nodded along, chiming in only to say, "We never meant to hurt you," the way someone says, "I never meant to spill wine on your rug." Like the damage was accidental, incidental, and certainly not their responsibility to clean up. They talked about missing me at the holidays, how empty the table felt without me, how they'd even saved my usual seat at Thanksgiving. I almost laughed at that, almost, because the only thing more ridiculous than pretending they'd noticed my absence was pretending they had ever truly noticed my presence. Lindsay stayed quiet for most of it, which surprised me. Her silence wasn't the polite kind. It was measured, deliberate. She was watching me, calculating. And I knew then that this wasn't about reconciliation. This was about control. They weren't here because they had finally understood me. They were here because they had lost their grip on me. And people like that don't come with open hands. They come with strings. It wasn't until my mother, tears in her voice, but not in her eyes, said, "We just want things to go back to normal," that I felt something sharp and cold settle in my chest. Because that sentence, that quiet, loaded plea, revealed everything. They hadn't come to understand me. They had come to reset the script, to pretend that the last year had been a detour, a phase, a temporary fracture that could be sealed with a pot of tea and some crocodile tears. They didn't want healing. They wanted erasure. And then, as if the universe couldn't help but prove my point, Lindsay finally spoke. Her voice was flat, almost bored. "I think you're being a little dramatic, Rachel. This whole silent treatment thing, it's childish. If you had a problem, you could have just said something." That's when I realized nothing had changed. Not the dynamics, not the hierarchy, not the delusions they wrapped themselves in. To her, to them, my absence was a tantrum. My silence, a tactic. My pain, a narrative inconvenience. So I set down my cup, looked directly at her, and said quietly, "I spent 30 years saying something. None of you heard me." The room went still. No one had a response. Because what do you say to that? How do you refute a truth you've spent your whole life avoiding? My mother reached for my hand. I didn't move. My father opened his mouth and then closed it again. Lindsay scoffed, muttered something about therapy buzzwords, and walked to the door. But for once, I didn't follow her. I didn't chase her to keep the peace. I let her go. They left shortly after. No hugs, no grand speeches, just three people walking out of my apartment like they had walked into a room they didn't recognize, unable to figure out when it stopped feeling like theirs. And me? I locked the door behind them, washed the cups, and went back to my work. Because nothing about their visit changed anything. Not the silence that came before, and certainly not the peace that followed. Closure is a word people throw around like it's a finish line you get to cross, like some neat ribbon you cut with a smile and a therapist nodding proudly from the sidelines. But the truth is, there is no finish line in real life. Not when it comes to family, not when it comes to decades of quiet wounds layered over each other like sediment. Each year, another thin sheet of what you swallowed instead of said, of what you gave up instead of explained. For me, there was never going to be a dramatic monologue or a Last Supper where I laid out every grievance and got the apology I deserved. What I got instead was something quieter, something colder, and strangely, something more powerful than I expected. Because when they finally left that day, the door didn't slam behind them in some symbolic act of defiance. No, I let it close slowly, gently, almost lovingly, because I wanted them to feel the absence, not the anger. In the days that followed, I heard nothing. No calls, no texts, no follow-up emails with guilt-laced pleas for reconciliation, or rambling letters that attempted to rewrite the past in more convenient terms. Just silence. And I think deep down, that's when I knew that my decision had landed, not as an act of rebellion, but as something they had no language for. They couldn't argue with me if I refused to stand in the courtroom. They couldn't accuse me of being ungrateful if I wasn't present to receive their version of generosity. And perhaps most unsettling of all, they couldn't cast me as the difficult one, the dramatic one, the cold one, if I didn't give them the ammunition to do so. But silence, even when chosen, even when savored, can still echo in strange ways. One night, months later, I found myself driving along the coast. No destination, no agenda, just a hunger for the kind of solitude that feels less like loneliness and more like clarity. I took the long road, the one that hugs the shoreline in slow curves, where you can see the ocean flicker like it's breathing. And somewhere between mile markers, I saw the sign, Seaside Point, the small coastal town where they'd bought Lindsay that beach house. I hadn't planned it. I hadn't thought about it in a long time. But my hands turned the wheel like they had their own memory, their own quiet curiosity. It took me less than 10 minutes to find it. Her house. The house. A 2-story, blue-shuttered thing with wide windows and a porch swing that looked more like decoration than use. The yard was unkempt, the grass patchy, the paint starting to fade. A small real estate sign hung crooked on the edge of the property. For sale. Price reduced. I didn't get out. I didn't need to. I sat in the car, engine idling, and let the sight settle into me. This house, this grand gesture, this monument to inequality, it was empty. On the market, unwanted. I imagined the laughter that had once echoed through it, the Instagram photos Lindsay probably posted, the family holidays I hadn't been invited to, the clinking of wine glasses, the filtered smiles, and now silence. Maybe they'd bought it thinking it would bring her stability. Maybe she'd asked for it. Maybe she hadn't. It didn't matter anymore. Because standing there, or rather sitting quietly across from that place, I understood something that hadn't fully clicked before. The beach house was never the betrayal. It was just the final proof. The proof that they'd always seen her need as more urgent, more deserving, more real. And mine had been brushed off as independence, toughness, self-sufficiency. And while I had grown into all of those things, I hadn't been born with them. I developed them out of necessity, out of survival. No one thought to ask what I'd needed because I never made them uncomfortable enough to notice. That house, now empty and unsellable, had become a metaphor too obvious to ignore. It was the shrine they'd built to the daughter they could see, And now it stood like a hollow monument to their misjudgment, their imbalance, their inability to recognize value that doesn't demand attention. And I didn't feel triumphant. I didn't feel bitter. I just felt done. I drove away without looking back, not out of defiance, but because I no longer needed to. Closure didn't come in the form of that visit or that house or even that silence. It came when I stopped waiting for someone else to hand it to me. It came when I stopped believing that understanding needed to be mutual in order for healing to be real. I had built something they could never give me, a life rooted in honesty, solitude, peace, and boundaries that didn't shift depending on guilt or obligation. People still ask me, when they find out I haven't spoken to my family in years, if I'm okay with it, if I ever plan to reconcile, if I think time will soften the sharp edges. And I always say the same thing, not because it's a line, but because it's the truest thing I've ever felt. I didn't leave to hurt them. I left because staying was hurting me. And maybe one day, they'll tell themselves whatever story makes it easier to sleep. That I was angry or confused or going through a phase. Maybe they'll even believe it. But I know the truth. I didn't disappear in a fit of rage. I didn't burn bridges. I simply stopped crossing them. I let them rot quietly from lack of use. And if they ever find their way to this version of me, the one who no longer needs their validation or their invitations or their half-hearted affection, I hope they realize this wasn't a door slammed in their faces. It was a door I'd kept open for far too long, one I finally let close, slowly, calmly, without a sound.